for that wonderful introduction. And it's great to meet you. This is the first time we're meeting. Ari speaks so highly of you, so it's great to know another one of Ari's, the FOAs, the Friends of Ari, right? Because they're inevitably wonderful people, and many of them are here tonight. I recognize so many names among the 112, sorry, 30 participants that we have tonight, and it's really exciting. I am exhausted. I just flew in from New York, and boy, are my arms tired. But actually, I did just fly into New York, from New York to Venice, where I'll be for a month now, through Purim. So if you want to come to Venice for Purim, you're welcome to. Really, I'm serious invitation. We'll be reading the Megillah in an egalitarian traditional service, and having lunch at our place in Venice, and Seudah, and you're all welcome. Just let me know in advance so we can know how to cater it. But if you want to come, you're welcome. So Venice is a very watery city, and it brings to mind some aspects of the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, that we'll talk about as we proceed. But, you know, when I think of Vayikra, I think of my days back in NCSY, and the song that was popular then, Bilvavi, you know, Bilvavi mishkan evne lehadar kivodo ubemishkan mizbeach asim lekane odo v'ne tamid ekachri et esh ha'akedah ולקורבן אקריב לו את נפשי היחידה, which means in my heart I will build a sanctuary to glorify God, and there I will light the fire of the binding of Isaac, and I will sacrifice my own self, right? Sometimes translated nafshi hayichida, sometimes translated as my own soul, but we should know that nefesh means the self, actually means the body, really, very often in biblical Hebrew. And you know, that allegorization, right, where the temple and the tabernacle and the priests and the sacrifices and the fire and the animals and the atonement is all us. It's an internal psycho-spiritual process, is a very good example of what people do with Leviticus. Because after all, what do you do with Leviticus? Just the name, right? Genesis, I can get into that, right? You know, beginnings, right? Exodus, it is what it says. They got out, right? Numbers, okay, there's a census. Deuteronomy, I don't know what the hell that is, okay? But Leviticus, right? Weird. Leviticus, Levites, what's that about? Leviticus means, in Latin, priestly things. Things applying to priests. And already, the Chatchila, when we're talking about priests, and we're talking about Judaism, right? We say priests, don't Hindus have priests? And Catholics have priests, right? Jews have priests, right? Well, yes, we invented that idea, right? Or at least it goes back very far with us. But now it's become sort of a symbolic vestige. You get called up to the Torah first if you're of the priestly descent, right? My point is this: as much as we try to allegorize the book of Leviticus and make it into some spiritual psychological process, it was once a very real thing. And the real thing that it was actually quite a profound thing, but it's scary and dreadful to us. Leviticus is a book that people approach with some dread. I approach it with dread because I read the Torah every week, you know, with cantillation aloud. And let me tell you, there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of boring detail. There's a lot of seemingly interchangeable parts. I was actually following along last week with reading the Torah with a facsimile of a medieval manuscript I'm working on called Kennicott III, which is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And this magnificent book that must have cost some Ashkenazic Jew in the 1290s, a ton of money, right? This person was of the elites, could have this manuscript written, contains numerous errors in the text of the Book of Leviticus. And they're what you would call learned errors. So for instance, it says, and you should make for the priests garments, right? And in one place it says garments for glory and honor. And the other place it says garments for service. So the person who is copying it, right, puts the words glory and honor where they don't belong. It's a mistake that someone who knows makes, and yet makes it because there's so much repetition. And I said last week, we're still in the book of Exodus, right? We're coming up to the book of Leviticus now. And even at the end of the book of Exodus, where priestly things, the tabernacle and the costumes and the ceremonies of the priests are introduced, it's still susceptible to that repetitious possibility of boredom where the same words occur again and again. I don't know if you know this, but Leviticus was the first book of the Torah taught to children in traditional cheders. When my eldest was a little boy in kindergarten, he went to we were ultra-Orthodox then, so he went to a Haredi cheder, and they didn't teach them Bereshit bara, in the beginning God created. And they didn't teach them the Elu Shmot, and these are the names of this is the story of the Exodus. They taught them Vayikra because there's so much repetition of words. Vayikra, V'yadaber, V'yasim, right? All these words that are verbal actions, all these descriptive nouns that repeat themselves. And that's another thing that was done with Leviticus. It was used as a teaching tool. But all these dodges, all these ways of thinking about and using Leviticus are really, well, they're avoidance strategies, because this is a book that's difficult to understand. So how should we approach this book if we want to sort of, tease out its secrets? Well, what we've been doing for Genesis and Exodus is, if you recall, we talked about the end of previous books and the beginning of next books and how that might work. And so just for an example, to refresh your memory, at the end of the book of Bereshit, at the end of the book of Genesis, both Jacob and Joseph are embalmed and put in sarcophagi in Egypt. Boom, end of book, right? Then we come to the beginning of the book of Exodus. Well, what's going on in the beginning of the book of Exodus? In the beginning of the book of Exodus, we see, really in the third chapter, after a sort of general introduction, we see a box, a little coffin, right? A pre-coffin, or cradle to grave, right? Moses's little basket or box floating on the Nile, right? That is a box with a person in it. And whereas at the end of Genesis, the person in the box was dead, right? Here, the person's life is beginning in that box. And so there's a connection between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. There's also a connection between the beginning of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. One of the most important things that Adam, the first creature, the first human creature, does at the very beginning of its career in the Bible is that it names all the animals. When you name something, you embody or understand its essence, as we explained when we talked about Bereshit, right? Exodus also begins with naming, the naming of the 12 tribes, right? So the books are intrinsically linked, beginning to beginning, end to beginning, and beginning to end, right? So in approaching Leviticus, we should, I believe, do the same thing. Well, what happens at the end of Exodus? My kids go to the college, have gone most of them so far. I have 4, but the youngest one may go elsewhere. He claims, he says, so what if I don't want to go to college? What if I want to go to community college, Abba? What do you do? This is a kid who 3 months ago wanted to go to Yale, right? But something called puberty hit him. And now he's not sure he wants to go to college, which is fine. But, my kids have gone to Vassar where I teach. And I remember when my first child was at Vassar, having him on campus was a novelty to me. So I figured I'd help the kid out. So I called him up. I said, Mish, I'm running out to the store. Can I bring you something? So he said, yeah, you can bring me some bread and some cheese, whatever. Thanks, Abba. So I get the stuff and I bring it to his dorm room, and I use my key card to get into the building, which at that point you can get into any building. It's a little scary, right? Professors can go into students' dorms. Doesn't happen anymore. That was a long time ago. So I go into his building and I knock on the door and there's giggling in the room. And the door opens and the hall fills with smoke. They were sitting in there doing what they were doing, and a hand reaches out and grabs the bag, and that's right. Right. So I was a little overwhelmed, but that image stayed with me. That's the image at the end of the book of Exodus, where God says to the people, remember this? Build me a space and I will dwell. Finish the sentence. You would be inclined to say in it, right? But God says, I will dwell in you. And yet when this space is built, a very detailed space, it has all these measurements. Remember we talked a little bit about that, right? It has all these amot and cubits and hands. But well, what's a cubit? From here to here, right? I'm a short guy, so your mileage may vary. What's a tefach? A handspan from here to here? I have tiny little hands, right? Your mileage may vary, right? So very specific instructions, and yet, oh, God is saying it must be tailored to each and every individual. And that action is what causes God to be, so to speak, in the world. For is there any place where God is not, right? But so to speak, in the world. Yet, when that tabernacle is built, it fills with a physical, literal cloud of God's presence. So when you fly in an airplane, as I did this morning, feels like 6 months ago, fly in an airplane, you can fly through a cloud, and there you are, surrounded by, I don't know, water molecules, right? Imagine being in a cloud of God. What would that be like? We talk about the cloud, cloud computing, right? But this is a cloud of God. And that's the way God says, it's okay, I'm here. And if you want to say, oh, you're here, let me hold on to you. Let me see what color your eyes are. Are you an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne, or a mom nursing a child, or a lion roaring? Let me grab onto you. God says, no, I'm just, you could breathe me in. I'm just around you, and I'm getting you very, very high, right? So that is the end of the book of Exodus. And then the book of Leviticus starts. The book of Leviticus asks, I believe, the following question. If we build a structure, right? If you build it, they will come, right? If we build it, that is God, will come, right? We build a structure and God comes, that's very nice. But, here's the thing, guys, okay? Maybe somewhere in a once upon a time fairy tale kind of time, you could build your little fairy castle and God would appear in it, right? But that just doesn't happen all the time in our world. So Leviticus is an instruction manual for reproducing that experience in concrete ways that are also symbolic ways that make the space and the time and the place for divinity to manifest itself in us, right? And so all the details of Leviticus, of the sacrifices, of purity and impurity, of the priesthood, right, are all designed to trigger the manifestation of God, or God's presence around us, right? To reproduce that original spontaneous experience of God appearing in the tabernacle. Now, here's the thing. Leviticus is a book that's very well oriented for a Zion-centric view of the world, because the tabernacle is built, and then eventually the Israelites make their way into the land of promise, and they build the temple, and then, you know, the temple is in Jerusalem, and it's a place more and more manifest. And, you know, and if you go to the what is the museum? The Hecht Museum on the campus of Haifa University, you can see the fragments of the decorations of the inner domes of the Beit HaMikdash. There, you can touch them with your hands, right? It becomes a thing in a place, Jerusalem, the temple, etc. But Leviticus is also designed as a do-it-yourself, user-friendly, transportable mode of making God's presence manifest, because it begins in the tabernacle. You see? So there's that tension there. The tabernacle wanders with the Israelites. It gets broken down and carried on shoulders and moved from place to place. So while eventually the model becomes a temple in Jerusalem, somebody had the genius idea of thinking, you know, we started out as a mobile people. Given the vicissitudes of history and the way the world works, we may end up being a mobile people again. Maybe we'll build a temple, but maybe it'll get destroyed. So it's good to have an idea that religion can be portable and user-friendly. And that's one of the things that Leviticus deals with. But Leviticus really begins at the end of Exodus, with the Parshiot that we looked at this past week, that we read, and that we will be repeating this Shabbat, which is Shabbat Shkalim, about a census. So before the tabernacle is finished, completed, etc., the people are numbered, and they have to bring mahatzit hashekel, half a shekel's weight of silver, which is a considerable bit of silver, kofer lenafsham, as a cover-up for themselves. Sometimes translated as an atonement for their souls. You know, I mean, who the hell knows what that means, right? An atonement for their souls. Kofer means to cover up, right? And nafsham means for themselves, right? Even better, maybe translation as a representation, in a way, of themselves. Now, you may know that later in the Bible, when King David tries to take a census of the people, he does it without this expediency of taking silver from them. He just counts them for his own purposes for the army, and terrible things ensue. And from that moment, you know, Jews are forbidden to count other Jews, right? That's a whole superstition that we have. But what is this business of I can only count you if you bring some silver with you? And the silver is from Melechet HaKodesh. It goes to the building of the tabernacle, goes to the creation of the space which will become an active space in the book of Leviticus. What does that mean? You only get counted if you bring money, right? That the rich should not give more, and the poor should not give less than this amount. It's not a huge amount, it's not a small amount, it's a symbolic amount. Why? Well, look, it's really good, fine and good to say, I'm all in. I'm all in spiritually. Give me a spiritual program. I'm all in. I'm dedicated. I'm committed to it. But unless you use your all-inness to actually create, to build, to make, right? Unless you contribute quite literally to the building, quite literally, of institutions, quite literally, then you don't count, you see, because you count in relation to community and not simply in relation to abstract community, but in relation to what community can do and build. And that parsha of Pikudei, of the accounts, right, of the Israelites and what they each bring to the project is the necessary perquisite for the book of Vayikra, because Vayikra means putting yourself in that space and activating the space of the tabernacle. How does the book of Vayikra begin? It doesn't begin with the word Leviticus. It begins with the word Vayikra, and God in square brackets, it, right? And it called, right? Interestingly, when you see the word in the Torah scroll, the letters Vav, Yud, Kuf, Resh are the normal size, and the Aleph is very, very small. There have been a lot of commentaries proffered on this, from the grammatical to the mystical. I like a combination of ideas about this. There are large and small letters throughout the Torah, and they're represented that way in even in contemporary Torah scrolls. If you get called up to the Torah, lucky enough to get called up to the Torah for the beginning of Parshat Vayikra, you will see that small aleph. If you take the word Vayikra and God called, and you remove the aleph, you have Vayikar, which means and God treasured or brought near, right? There's a number of, Sadja has one theory on what it means, and Rashi has another theory. But it has the sense of chavivut, of love and attachment. And the aleph at the end of that word represents divinity. Right? Now you'd say, right? Divinity has to be a pretty freaking big aleph, right? That should be, remember we talked about the book of Exodus, how when God articulates the first of the words of the 10 commandments, right? The 10 sayings, 10 statements, it's the word Anochi, but God doesn't even get past the letter aleph, because that aleph, even without a vowel, God doesn't get to the vowel. It's just the opening of the glottis, and all 600,000 Israelites, aside from the women and children, as the Torah puts it when it numbers them, right? 600,000 plus some insignificant people like women and children, right? 600,000 Israelites plus the women and children, they all die. And they have to be resurrected with the dew of resurrection. So that aleph is very powerful. The aleph of Anochi is a gigantic aleph. The aleph of Vayikra is a small aleph. That's because when you bring somebody near you, even if you're God, have to contract, have to make yourself ze'er, small, in order that the us can fill the space. Doesn't mean to negate yourself, doesn't mean that God forbid, negates God's self, right? But that even God has to make space for the other, and that's Vayikra. And if you look at it kabbalistically, gematrically, numerically, right? Vav is 6. I'm terrible at math. I would be an awful Kabbalist. That's why I'm not a Kabbalist. I teach a course on Kabbalah. My students are so disappointed when I tell them that I'm a Maimonidean rationalist, right? But I can be interested in Kabbalah, right? It's right. So Vav is 6, Yud is 10, Kuf is 100, Resh is 200. So you have 1 plus 6 is 16, plus 300, 316, or 613, that's another way of looking at it. 6 plus 1 is 7, plus 3 is 9, right? Did I get that right? 16 plus, no, I'm sorry. Wait. Let me do this again. I have a whiteboard in my head. Okay. Vav, 6. Yud, 16. Kuf Resh, 200 plus 100 plus 200 is 300. 316. 6 plus 1 is 7. Plus 3 is 10. Okay. See, got it eventually. That's why I don't teach math. Okay. That's why I can't balance my checkbook. That's why when Ari pays me, he pays me. I'm sure he pays everybody else a lot more, but I can't figure it out. So okay. So the beginning letters are 10, which represent the Sfirot. There are 10 Sfirot, right? And the Sfirot are, simply put, the way God gets from what's out there and huge and unfathomable, like a cloud filling everything, to what's in here, this very small, narrow space in our hearts. In my heart, it's a very, very small, narrow space. As I've told you very often, I have neither a heart nor a soul. So, right, so for that to get in here, right, that's the Sfirot, okay? And then the Aleph represents the Ein Sof, the unending. But instead of the Aleph being vast, it's small. Okay? Also, right, 316, 613 is the number of 613, the commandments, right? So the commandments are explicit, and then behind the commandments, in a whisper, Kol Dimamadaka, a still, small voice beyond the commandments that are shouting loud and blowing trumpets and shaking plants and separating milk and meat, and beyond all of that, right? There's a whisper. There's a whisper, if you can hear it, of that Aleph. And Vayikra is saying, God calls to Moses and says, speak to the people and tell them this is the way it's going to be. This is the way you're going to get me in the world, right? Now this, if you think about it, is an outrageous concept, because if there is a God, and God is the creator, sustainer, etc., and so vast, right? Why should God, A, care at all about the world? B, why should God want to be in the world if the world is in God, right? That's why God is called Hamakom, the place, right? Because God is the place of the world and not the other way around, right? And why should God need our help? Why should God need our help? Right? Well, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make noise? Right? If there's no one around to hear it, did it really happen? So the Midrash and the philosophers, even when maintaining God's utter status as Deus absconditus, the hidden God, right, beyond everything, also want to talk about God's intimacy and presence and our role in that, right? Elie Wiesel said, God invented humans because God loves stories. God, like any of us, likes to hear stories. That's the reason God creates the universe, because otherwise God would just be sitting around contemplating God's godness, right? There would be an undifferentiated, what we call technically in philosophical terms, thing, right? There would be this undifferentiated thing out there, right? And no distinction, nobody to talk to it, nobody to talk about it, nobody, right? So that active presence of storytelling is, that active practice, of storytelling is very, very important. Leviticus, in fact, is about separations and distinctions between things, between concepts. And I want to talk about a couple of them in a second. I want to talk about divine justice and human justice, as discussed in Leviticus. And I want to talk about intimate transcendence and immanence, bigness, outsideness, and smallness, interiority. And I want to also talk about, there was one other thing that, purity and impurity. These are three big concepts, you'll agree, to discuss. But I first want to talk about this character of Aaron the priest in the book of Leviticus and his sons and the priesthood. Look, the priesthood was a real thing, right? When you meet somebody today named Cohen or Kagan or whatever, any of the variants, and who is of Kahanic descent, you'll notice that a lot of these guys, and the women too, are big, tall people, right? They're descended from people who were literally butchers, who had to, wrestle cows. And we'll talk about a little bit about, that idea of cow wrestling being at the center of the Jewish religion. It's so bizarre, but okay, we'll talk about it. And there is a Cohen gene, this whole interesting saga of a people, indigenous people in East Africa called the Lemba, who for a long time claimed that they were the descendants of the Israelites, as many African indigenous peoples have done. Sometimes it happens because Christian missionaries came to those societies and they gave them the Bible and they said, well, this Old Testament Hebrew Bible part sounds like, tribal. I like that. But this Jesus bit, I can't relate to that. So we must be connected with, right? Or, people are like, oh, I see that, Israel is looking for people to populate settlements, on hilltops. Maybe if I'm a Jew, they'll take me, I'll go there, right? Right? There are all kinds of motives for discovering you're actually descended from ancient Israelites, even though to look at you, it seems unlikely, right? Because you don't fit into the typical Ashkenazic, Sephardic, the Jews we know about, right? But actually, there are many people all over the world who really have these stories. And the Lemba were one of them. But their story was interesting because they said that they were, they were essentially something the Mishnah calls Ir Shel Kohanim, a city that was very priestly heavy. Their society was very priestly heavy. And so when the project to determine if there was a Kohanic gene took off, they tested these people and they found, they had the same genetic marker as Mr. Shlomo Cohen of 38th Street in Borough Park, right? These people in East Africa. So they're, Kohanim are a real thing, and people have kept lines of descent. Leviim, right? The Levites. At a certain point in history, they had a 400-piece orchestra. That's pretty good. And a huge choir. If you walked in the Temple of Jerusalem, you wouldn't probably recognize what they were doing as music, right? It would sound to you like as if you'd walked into, I don't know, a Hindu temple, right? It would sound strange to your ears if you weren't used to it, right? Because the music was very different. But there was an orchestra with instruments and a choir. And throughout most of Jewish history, there's been this prayerful desire for the restoration of that exact thing, So let me tell you, because I come from them, there are lots of people in this world who are Jews. Actually, there aren't a lot of people in this world who are Jews. And the percentage of people in this world who are Jews who actually do what I'm about to tell you is even smaller. But among Jews, there's a considerable number of Jews who are praying 2 or 3 times a day for the actual restoration of the temple with animal sacrifices, et cetera, right? Even though some enlightened types, like, Maimonides, who was enlightened in most areas, except he thought that women were of light intellect, but, can't win them all, I guess. I'd like to win them all, but I'm no Maimonides. What can I say? Maimonides or Rav Kook, they both opine that in the future, the sacrifices would be replaced by prayers, or they would be only grain sacrifices. They would be, right? So this idea of sacrifice would no longer be animal sacrifices. We'll talk about that in a second. But even they prayed daily for the restoration of the temple. But boy, are the Kohanim and the Leviim, as mentioned in the book of Leviticus, are they out of a job? I mean, you could not have a worse workplace experience than they did, right? Here they are, right, going about their business of cattle wrangling and burning incense and all these things that seem strange and alien that I'll explain in a second, hopefully in a way that you can relate to. And boom, the temple is destroyed. And meanwhile, I had a friend who used to say she never cooked any recipe that had the word meanwhile in it. right? Okay, so you know you're in trouble when a recipe has meanwhile. You have to you see yourself as a multi-handed, you know, Hindu god. Okay, and meanwhile there were these rats in a sinking ship. These proto-rabbis, these prushim, these Pharisees, who were teaching people that you didn't have to be of Kohanic descent to take hold of Torah, right? You could. It was a democracy, and the person who learned the most had the most status. And they were preparing people for the inevitable moment when that temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. The rabbinical class rose up, right? Took hold of Judaism, and all those poor Kohanim were out of the job. And so, when we think about this idea of the restoration of the temple, or we think about the task of the Kohanim, what are we thinking about? What was lost? You know, do we care? Are we just, if we're very frum and we're praying every day, the temple should be restored with its fires and its sacrifices be acceptable unto you, blah, 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 blah. We're just saying this stuff, right? What does it mean? Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, the tabernacle and the temple were models of the universe. They had an orrery in them. Do you know what an orrery is? An orrery is a model of the planets, right, relative to each other. Maybe you saw one of these in fourth grade. They probably have them virtually now, but we had one in our classroom, right, where you could see the relative sizes of the sun, right, on the moon and Venus and Mars and, you know, the recently demoted planet Pluto at the very end. So the tabernacle had in it representations of animal, vegetable, mineral. I'm not going to go into all of it, right? The known planets in the form of the menorah, right? The four elements: water, air, earth, and fire. And the tabernacle was a model in miniature of the universe in which the priests engaged in symbolic actions that, if you think of it in a sort of anthropological sense, that affected divinity, right? It's almost blasphemous to say that. Or maybe we want to be less blasphemous and say they modeled what should be going on in divinity. It was as if that was the place, the laboratory, where the world, the imbalances in the world could be righted, as I'll explain in a second. We don't really know too much about it. We know the technical details, but even the technical details are garbled because they appear in the Mishnah, which was redacted at a time after the temple was gone already, as a sort of zecher, as a sort of memory of the temple, right? The greatest scholar of the Book of Leviticus is a man named Jacob Milgram. You may know a Milgram, Californians, in your community. Yes, he is the son of that Jacob Milgram. Jacob Milgram was a great scholar of the Book of Leviticus and did a wonderful edition. And he really was mesader the whole thing. He explained how all the pieces fit together, and I'll be using some of his material in a second. But here's a secret, okay? You know how he knew? This is a sober professor like me, much more sober than I am, actually, because I like to joke a lot, right? But he was, a sober professor. Do you know how he knew what the priests did in the temple and how he could explain it so beautifully and clearly? He said, I was a priest in the temple. I'm reincarnated. That was my past life. Very, very Californian of him, I would think. But so in a way, it all made sense to him. In a way, it didn't make sense to other people, and he transmitted it to other academics. And it's his model that academics talk about today. So that's an interesting Leviticus fact. Okay, sacrifice. What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? What hath butchery to do with spirituality? Okay, it's like this. Shirel, you steal my my iPhone. Okay, you steal my iPhone, which I can't live without, right? So we catch up with you, and you have to make restitution. So you have to return the judges. We go to court. The judges say you have to return my iPhone. If you've gotten rid of the iPhone or sold it or whatever, you have to give me monetary compensation. You have to recompense me for the problems that ensued as a result of not having my iPhone. Let's say I didn't have my iPhone. I had an important job interview. I missed the interview. Now I lost my other job. Now I'm living on the street in a cardboard box, right? So you're responsible for that because you stole the iPhone, Shiro, okay? So you have to pay monetary damages for all those things. Once you finish doing all of those things, you're okay with me. We are even. But you know what? God told you that you shouldn't steal. Actually, you shouldn't kidnap. And if you can't kidnap, this is in the 10 Commandments. If you can't kidnap, there's all kinds of other things that come under that rubric, including stealing iPhones. Okay, you shouldn't steal, Shirao. Now, what do you have to do to get atoned with God? Well, God created you, so you screwed up. So really, you should just, be killed. But we don't do that, right? So we want you to take something very valuable to you. Let's say your Tesla. You have a Tesla? Why don't you have a Tesla, Shira? Okay. You take your Tesla, okay, and we're going to pour gasoline on the outside of the Tesla instead of on the front. But before we do that, you're going to put your whole body on the Tesla and say, I stole Mark's iPhone. I was really sorry about it. I've done everything I could to make good with him. And now I know that, God, that I owe you my life, but instead I'm going to give something that's valuable to you. And you stand there and you watch this mechanic, who's called a priest, pour gas on your Tesla and set it afire, and it explodes in a fiery, you say, there, but for grace of God, literally, go I. What happens in that process? Well, there's a catharsis, right? You see something valuable to you in the case of an animal, right? As a former vegetarian, it does have an impact on me. You see a life spent in symbolic place of your life. And it's supposed to be cathartic. It is the final level of a process that cannot be entirely satisfied in civil courts. You ever see the way Goyim do funerals, right? They do the funeral, they do the wake, whatever, and then they go back to work the next day. When are they supposed to process it? Jeez. I've met so many depressed people because they didn't have this long process of mourning and separation, right? When you do something to another person that affects them in a way that affects them very personally, it's not the end of the process to simply give recompense or pay damages. And so that process of sacrifice enabled that kind of catharsis. The biggest separation between humans and God, according to Leviticus, is the gulf of death. Speaking of mourning, right? Do not underestimate what it means to a living person to encounter death. I don't know how many of you, God forbid, have seen a dead body or been in the presence of dead bodies. I know people who are, my age, which is old, right, who never have, right? When a man lost something that could have produced a life, semen, or a woman extruded something that could have produced a life, an egg, or a person came in contact with an actual dead body, that person experienced, so to speak, a life leak. Life leaked out of them. And they needed a process by which they could reintegrate. So they would separate from the community, eventually immerse themselves in a well of living water. Water was very important in Leviticus, as it is on this canal outside my window, right? And symbolically re-enter, be reborn into the community. Purity and impurity. They had nothing to do with dirtiness and yuckiness versus cleanness and happiness. They had to do with the fact that we touched or saw death or something that had the potential to create life, and we have to mourn it. This is not to say in Judaism, not to say that sperm and eggs have the status, or fetuses have the status of living beings. That's not what I'm saying, but they have this power and this potential, and their loss has to be mourned, right? You don't just go about your business when you see a dead body or touch a dead body or encounter a dead body or lose a life-producing force from yourself. And so one would go through a whole complex procedure involving the priest as the mediator of the whole circumstance, which would then reintegrate you with the power of life. The ultimate example of this is the idea of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur was very, very important in the Book of Leviticus. You could say that the Book of Leviticus builds up to this idea of Yom Kippur. And next year, when we, God willing, talk about it again, I'll get into Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, and their deaths and that relationship to Yom Kippur. But suffice it to say that Yom Kippur is the situation with me and Shir El, but without the pen and without the court and without the damages. Yom Kippur is about things that we did in the abstract that violated our relationship with a God that we cannot see and whom most of us don't actually speak with, right? But who we know or depend or experience as being there. And how do we reconcile those things? Well, a very complex and very detailed and actually very beautiful and cathartic ceremony is detailed in Leviticus regarding Yom Kippur. And I guess since we don't have time today, we'll move to that for next year. I just want to say one thing in conclusion. My teacher was a flawed individual, as we all are, and knew it, I think, of himself, Reb Shlomo Carlebach. He used to say that Jews are so abject and downtrodden in, boy, it was the last century, right? In the 20th century, and so unable to connect with spiritual things because after the Holocaust, we're all like Kohanim who have become impure through contact with the dead. That is, we're so scarred by the events of the middle of the 20th century that a priest who comes into contact with the dead cannot perform as a priest because you can only heal other people's life leaks if you yourself are whole and if you yourself come from a place of simcha and joy. And so Reb Shlomo said, the reason why Jews are schlepping through the 20th century without enough spirituality and without enough joy is that Nebuch was scarred from the Holocaust. So my blessing for you and for me and for all of us is that we can find that joy in our hearts to truly connect with whatever God is and to fix all the imbalances in the universe and that death be swallowed up forever. I'm ready to answer some questions if you have.
So thank you, Marc. I opened the chat for questions and we already have one from Rina that was asking about the connection between Ruby Namdar's book, Ruin House, and Leviticus, if you're familiar with his book.
Well, I know him. I must admit, though I haven't admitted to him, he was a fellow Heschel parent. My kids went to the Heschel school. I have not read the book, but here's the thing. He has been a guest at CSP, and if you want to know more about that, you should get Ari to bring him again, and he can tell you that. But I don't know. I'm sorry. It's one of the many things I don't know. Go ahead.
As I'm waiting for more questions, I'll also just mention that something that you said about holding a structure to allow divinity to come, it does sound a lot the way artists think of going to the studio, that inspiration won't come if we don't do anything, but rather we need to clock in to allow space for the inspiration.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Because, well, you know, we like to talk, particularly, you know, us artsy fartsy people, you know, we like to talk about, well, being artists. Well, you're not being an artist, you're doing art. And that's really important, that distinction between being and doing. You need to open up the space in that way. Good.
And I wanted to ask if maybe you can say a little more. You mentioned Maimonides and the Rav Kook, and I know the Rav Kook, he has his text of, I know it in Hebrew, Chazon HaTzimchonut VaShalom, the vision of vegetarianism and peace. Maybe you can say a few words about all those sacrifices and gory details.
Right. So look, look, somebody asked me the other day about circumcision, right? About Brit Milah, and reading a lot of anti-circumcisionist texts and how this is a violent act against male babies and results in psychological damage and all that. And there's I don't have an answer to that except to say that it is that very often there are things that are violent, difficult to absorb, that are also cathartic and also shake us out of our complacency in the world. I mean, I had 3 boys, and it was very, very hard to read, to watch that going on, and sacrifice is the same. I mean, it's not like having your kid being surgically having genital surgery in front of you, right? But just to see a sacrifice happening and blood flowing from an animal and knowing it's because of you and that you're involved in that, it's a very intense thing. Nonetheless, both Maimonides simply said that we evolved to a place where prayer takes the place of sacrifice. That if there is a third temple, as he believed that there would only be prayer in the third temple. There wouldn't be sacrifice. Rav Kook said that there would be sacrifice, but it would be symbolic sacrifices of grain, the mincha offering, which already exists. All the sacrifices also had a vegetarian alternative, so to speak, along with them. And so he has this vision in which Dafka, that's why it's called Chazon, the vision of vegetarianism and peace, in which Dafka, the abandonment of the sacrificial system, is what betokens and initiates and speaks to the idea of world peace. So Rav Kook was very radical in a lot of ways. He was also really, really difficult to understand because he's just very poetical sometimes, and I'm not sure that I'm sure he knew what he was saying, but it's very dense and hard to get through poetically sometimes. But what he said, disguised in all this sort of grandiose poetic language, essentially is that what was so central and so essential, I'm trying to get you to understand that, in Jewish tradition in the ancient period, the abandonment of that itself will be cathartic. So somebody said, the old joke among Catholics, what are you giving up for Lent? Right? I'm giving up Lent for Lent, right? Right? So in Rav Kook's mind, the sacrifice was the sacrifice of sacrifice. Verstehst? Okay. What else?
So can you peep in the chat? There are quite a few questions
they're good.
going
okay,
on here.
Let's look at this.
So I'll let you take the pick.
Okay, Rena, I'll try to read Namdai's book. I will, but just don't tell him I didn't read it. I didn't lie to him and said I read it, but I didn't say anything about it. Okay, sacrifice was a letting of blood, right? So look, there's a lot of things we got to deal with here. Okay, what I like to imagine is that behind a lot of this stuff that we read about in the Torah, there is some truly profound idea. And that profound idea is an idea for the ages and continues into, post-modernity and should be relevant for us as well, okay? But the Torah was given to people who were at a different place in civilization than we are, who thought differently about things and expressed things differently. So they talk about blood pleasing God or God smelling the smell of the sacrifices, right? So at the same time as I'm advocating for understanding how these things worked literally and why they were powerful, I also want to say that what lies behind the literal power of these ideas is something that's profound, that is in fact also metaphoric. And so we shouldn't the takeaway shouldn't be that God is this, gourmand sitting on a throne in heaven, smelling the smell of the sacrifices with a large joint of a gigantic turkey drumstick in his hand, getting grease in his beard, right? They like to think about it that way because that's maybe how they thought about the universe. I'm not putting a value judgment on it, right? But we have to understand it as simultaneously literal and metaphorical. Yes, tzedakah, Howard, is a separate mitzvah from sacrifice. It's a separate and distinct duty. Sacrifice is between you and God. Sacrifice is an attempt to breach the gap between the immaterial God. That's why the smoke and the smell is the metaphor, right? The immaterial God who you've wronged, but you can't walk up and shake their hand and say, okay, I'll make it up to you, right? And tzedakah is an act of justice toward fellow people. Both involve giving up something of value and having less comfort for yourself as a result. But tzedakah is we use the word, sacrifice in too loose a way for Leviticus. For Leviticus, sacrifices meant these specific type of sacrifices. And Arnold, you're correct that there are sacrifices that were not guilt sacrifices, but sacrifices that were joy sacrifices, right? So zevach mishpacha, right? Thanksgiving sacrifices. In those cases, the animals were sacrificed because people like to barbecue. You and I may not like it because we're you're probably a vegetarian and I'm a quasi-vegetarian. The idea of sitting down to a feast of animal flesh is not that appealing to me, although a good pastrami sandwich on occasion will get me. So it's like anything else. We do things out of a variety of motivations, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of thanksgiving, sometimes out of joy. Right. Yes. And Rosa, prayer did replace sacrifices, and that was my mommy's position. Guys, it's been so lovely to be with you. In a way, it ruins the Torah for me because, now we're going to start on Vayikra, right? But I'm going to want to rush through Vayikra so I can get to talk about Bamidbar with you, right? Which is the one that comes after. So it is really a joy to be with you. I'm going to go to sleep because I think I've been up for 48 hours. And I'm sorry if I didn't have the steam that I usually have. My wife looked at me on Zoom today. She said, darling, she's Hungarian, so she talks like that. Darling, you look a bit tired. I said, yes, I am a bit tired. So I'm going to go and get into bed and hopefully get up at the right time in Venice tomorrow so I can do my things. And it's really been lovely seeing you. And thank you for your kind words. And keep being kind to each other. And Cheryl, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure to listen. Thank you for making for us time and space to allow some godliness in. And good night and good morning, and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are on the globe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.